they miss your voice for sure. So. All right. Well, hey, if you wouldn't mind making your way, grabbing a seat. It is good to have you with us tonight as we are launching into a brand new series tonight called Joyride, where over the next several weeks we're going to be looking at this topic of joy. And really, what is joy? How do we get it? And why does it matter? And to do that, to sort of unpack what joy is, we're going to be kind of taking a journey together through this book of the Bible known as the book of Philippians. And it's a book that's really actually more a letter. It's a letter to the church at Philippi. It was a church that Paul, from the moment that he wrote it, this was a church that he'd planted sort of 10 years earlier. And so he's writing this note. And of course, if you're going to study the topic of joy, I can't think of a better book of the Bible to study that topic than through the book of Philippians. In fact, the whole book of Philippians is really, it's all about one big letter of encouragement. In fact, it's very different from all the other letters that Paul would write to these churches, because most of the letters that Paul would write, typically they were incredibly instructive, or even incredibly challenging. He was trying to teach them something, try to maybe even challenge them or confront them on some issues. And yet the book of Philippians is really all about encouragement. It's all about this topic of joy. In fact, 16 times throughout this book, through this letter, Paul refers to joy. And it's because of this, you kind of look at it and it's like, well, why write a whole letter around this ideal? Like, why was it so important to Paul to get this message specifically to the Christians, to the community of believers at the church of Philippi? And I think to really kind of understand it, and over the next several weeks, we're really going to unpack, really what it is, and we're going to kind of break down a lot more of these verses in Philippians. But tonight, I just want to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of sort of the reason for joy, sort of the importance of joy, and kind of answer a little bit of that question of why joy. And I think to really understand it, you have to understand a little bit the context in which Paul is writing this letter to the church of Philippi. See, maybe just as significant as what is said throughout this book is what is not said, especially given the circumstances. Because what you got to understand is that when Paul is writing this letter to the church of Philippi, he is in prison. And we're talking like real prison, not like Martha Stewart prison, where like in the backfield there's like, tennis courts and, massage chairs and all that. We're talking like real hardcore prison, as Paul would actually find himself when he's writing this letter of Philippians. He's actually writing it from death rows. He'd been thrown into this hardcore, very tough prison, tough situation, tough circumstance for literally just simply preaching the gospel. And again, talk about a tough situation. Again, this is not, just a comfortable prison, upper class prison. In fact, actually, when you read through Philippians, you discover that he was literally chained to a guard. Imagine being chained to a guard 24/7. Like you can't really move around. You can't, go to the mess hall. You can't even go to the bathroom in privacy. This is a bad situation. And then to make matters worse, to sort of add insult to injury, some of Paul's opponents, some of even fellow believers that sort of opposed kind of Paul, whether it be his personality, whether it be his teaching, they sort of took advantage of his situation. And in fact, at points, literally would try to kind of spread rumors about Paul and Paul's motivations. And in fact, we kind of can see the setting. We see this in Philippians chapter 1, verse 15 through 17. It says, "It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. Now get this. So I mean, here he's in prison. He's on death row. He's got people, kind of coming against him, spreading rumors about him. I mean, taking advantage of his situation, his troubles. And you would almost expect from this moment on, the rest of the book of Philippians, all 4 chapters, to sort of become a woe is me tour, right? I mean, and in fact, actually, probably the readers, those who are reading this letter, that's probably what they expected too, and would have totally understood. I mean, they would have been okay. I mean, geez, Paul's in a tough situation, tough circumstances, totally acceptable, totally understandable if he were to spend the next 4 chapters just starting to talk about, man, how miserable my situation is, how bad my circumstances are, how frustrated I am, how exhausted I am. They would have totally understood that. And yet instead, rather than complaining, rather than throwing his hands up, rather than just kind of giving up and kind of taking this defeated mindset, this victim mindset, Paul would spend the next 4 chapters penning some of the most encouraging verses in all of Scripture. In fact, rather than even just focusing on his situation, he'd actually take the time to really encourage the readers, encourage somebody else, to try to give them hope. In fact, he would go on to pen, God would use him to pen some of these verses that even if you're new to church, we've all probably seen on a t-shirt or on a bumper sticker, on a coffee mug, things like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, or worry about nothing, pray about everything. Or I'm confident that the good work God has begun, he's faithful to complete it. It's amazing, right? I mean, think about, given those circumstances, death row, how he could spend an entire letter encouraging somebody else, talking about this joy that he had. I mean, and again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense on the exterior from a human sense, from a human perspective. In fact, I look at it and I would think that when it comes to some of those scriptures, some of those verses out of the Bible, that when I think of ones that Paul would pen, given his circumstances, I would have totally thought of a whole other array of scriptures that would have come out of Paul's mouth at that time. In fact, scriptures that you don't tend to find on a coffee mug or on a Christian t-shirt or on a bumper sticker. I mean, given Paul's circumstances, you'd almost expect him to be the one that God uses to share verses like this, like Ecclesiastes 2:17. So I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. Which I'm actually thinking, I'm like, man, I need to go into business, like the most uninspirational Bible verse mugs ever. Like, you'd almost expect him to kind of pin those. Or when he thought of his detractors, to pin a verse like Deuteronomy 28:27. The Lord will afflict you with inflammation, hemorrhoids, rash, and itch, So I gotta say, that would be a great coffee mug to have, right? Or this verse, let them be like a snail that dissolves into slime. Like that's what you would almost expect to come out of his mouth, and yet he goes the total opposite way. Rather than that, he actually opens up this letter, rather than complaining, rather than getting frustrated, rather than speaking ill will against his enemies or the opposition or those who would come against him. Listen to what he says. He says in Philippians 1, verse 3-6, I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy. Some of us, we stub our toe, and praying with joy is like the last thing that's like coming to our mind, right? And he goes on and says, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, and get this, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ. In other words, look, look, I know it looks bad right now. I know it looks like this is the end of my story. I know that my opponents, the opposition, the people that would wish ill on me are writing my obituary. But I'm telling you, listen, I'm confident. I have a confidence that he who began a good work is faithful to complete it. In other words, not so fast. In fact, I actually titled this message, Not So Fast Food. That when sometimes the circumstances seem impossible, sometimes the circumstances seem overwhelming, listen, you got to look a little bit deeper. And that's kind of what Paul would actually go on to say this very thing. He goes on in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11 through 13, kind of gets to the root, the secret of why he could be so confident, why he could have this perspective of joy, even in the midst of so much turmoil and frustration and seeming setback. He goes on to say this, I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want, I can do all this through him, through Christ, who strengthens me. You know, a lot of times when we read that verse or we put it on a bumper sticker, typically we see it through the lens of kind of a positive spin on it. I can do all things like I'll never fail, I'll never stumble, I can make it no matter what, you know? And yet, it's so much more than that. When he's saying, I can do all things, this isn't just, you'll never fail, you'll never struggle. He's sitting there saying, listen, no matter what I'm going through, no matter what the circumstance, no matter what the opposition, no matter what the difficulty, I can make it through this. I can get through this. Because here's the secret. Here's why I could be so confident that, hey, not so fast. I know everyone else is writing me off. Here's why he could be so confident. Here's why he could have joy even in the midst of such incredible hardship. Is because of him who gives me strength. See his joy, his confidence, this different perspective, it was rooted simply and solely in a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's where he found the secret. That's where he found a different attitude, a different perspective on his circumstances. See, the secret of his joy, the secret of his confidence was in this relationship with Jesus. It was in a perspective that rather than focusing and putting his faith in his circumstances, put his faith in the very character of our God. The very character of our God. In fact, I like how there's one translation in the Message, actually, in Philippians 4. Rather than saying, I found the secret, it says, I found the recipe. I found the recipe. Growing up, my grandmother was an amazing cook. Amazing cook. She could take the most random things, the most random ingredients, and turn them into something amazing. And I don't know where she kind of learned this art, gained this ability. Could have been, she grew up in a really small town in the middle of Texas, middle of nowhere. And she grew up without a whole lot of resources, without a lot of stuff. And somewhere in that, I think she just gained this ability, she gained this skill that she could take ingredients, again, just the most remote things. I mean, she could take pickles, and she could take sugar, and she could take some flour, and create a cake. Or create these amazing cookies, or create pie. And like every time you're like, this is amazing. And when you look at the ingredients, you're like, there's no way that this could ever make anything good. And listen, I share that with you because I think it really kind of gets to the heart of what Paul's getting at, is that listen, his faith wasn't rooted in the ingredients, but in the skill of the chef, but in the skill of the cook, in the ability of our God. And our God, as we're going to come to discover tonight, is that he's a God who can take regardless of the ingredients, he can take the very worst of ingredients, the very worst of adversity, the very worst of your situation, the very worst of your struggles, and when given over to the hands of God, he can form something so much greater and so much more amazing than you could ever imagine or hope or expect. That's our God. That's why Paul was able, even in the midst of hardship, to sit there and say, I've got confidence still. This is not over yet. This is just the beginning of what God is wanting to do in my life. I've got a God who's a chef. I've got a God who can take these ingredients, these circumstances, these situations, and turn it to work for my good and ultimately his glory. And so I want to kind of unpack this a little bit of kind of how this works. Like, how does God do this? And to kind of do that, I want to look at a kind of a parallel passage in the Bible. In fact, it's interesting. When I was studying Philippians, I was really drawn to this psalm that David writes. And it's a psalm that, again, whether you're new to church or not, most of us have some general idea of. It's a Psalm 23. Psalm 23, and it's amazing the parallels. I mean, it's amazing how similar some of the content, some of the words, some of the hope and direction is. And I think gives us insight of how God can take some of the worst ingredients and create some of the most amazing dishes for his purpose, for our good, and ultimately his glory. And so we see this in Psalm chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. And again, I think in David's words, we're going to get greater insight into Paul's perspective when it comes to joy, when it comes to even difficult and tough situations, even when those situations are opposition literally against us. And so it kicks off, it starts off, it says, the Lord is my shepherd, I have all that I need. The Lord is my shepherd, I have all that I need. Now, not to get too caught up on a rabbit trail here, but when he's saying that, I think it's important to note, when he says, the Lord is my shepherd, I have all that I need, you got to know this doesn't mean that David never had any needs. In fact, even going back to Paul's words, Paul said the same thing in so many ways. Hey, whether in plenty or in want, I have no needs. Not saying that you and I, we never have needs. What both of them are getting at is that, hey, listen, it doesn't mean, again, my appetite goes away. It just means I go to a different buffet now. I eat off a different menu now. See, I think so often in church especially, sometimes we can get so caught up in like behavior modification with people. It's like we think that the root of change, the root of transformation is if we deal with the behavior. And some of you grew up in a church like that. It was kind of deal with the behavior, let's just act a certain way, look a certain part. And yet what I love about this is that what he's speaking, what he's getting at is that you got to, rather than, if you want to experience true transformation and true change, listen, you got to go beyond just the behavior. You got to get to the need that drives the behavior. And whether you're a believer or not, we've all got these needs. And unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is sometimes we'll take a negative, a self-destructive behavior, a self-sabotaging behavior, and sometimes even when we unpack it, even when we uncover the need that's driving it, sometimes we associate the need with the behavior. We associate the need as also being a bad thing, also being a destructive thing. But here's where I want you to get. Do you realize that there is no need you're currently trying to meet in your life that is an evil need or a bad need? There's no need in your life that you're currently trying to meet that in and of itself is an evil need or a bad need. No, and listen, I think the reason I want to share this is because especially any of you that struggle with an addiction or you struggle with something that's just like you feel like you just can't seem to ever get over, experience victory in your life, you got to understand the need itself, need in and of itself is not bad. But here's what you got to get though as well. And what David's trying to express, it's not that you're not meeting the wrong need. It's just that you're just meeting it with the wrong means. You're meeting it with the wrong means. See, the need itself is not a bad thing. It's just unfortunate, a lot of times we try to meet it with the wrong means. So often what happens is the person, when you look at the person who ends up kind of drinking their life away, the need that's driving that is a need oftentimes for healing. Again, the need's not bad, but it's the means to which you're trying to meet that need that can be incredibly destructive. Or maybe the person who gets caught up in lust or sexual addiction and being driven by this need for companionship. The need, again, is not a bad thing. God, even it says in the Bible, it's not good for a man to be alone. There's a need there for companionship. The problem, again, it isn't with the need, it's with the means to which we choose to meet it. And so getting back to David and getting back to Paul, they bring it back around. It's like, listen, hey, look, you're going to have needs. The needs aren't the bad thing. It's the means in which you're choosing to meet those needs That will determine whether you step into a joyride, whether you step and walk in joy, walk in victory, walk in freedom, or whether you don't. So again, he's not saying, hey, listen, you'll never have needs. But he's sitting there saying, listen, I found the only one that can truly satisfy all those needs in my life. And so it continues on here. Verse 2, it says, he lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I would not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. And then here's the verse that we're going to camp on with the moments we have left. It says, you prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessing. I love that. You prepare a feast for me. See, this is the first thing when it comes to God, who will sometimes take these ingredients and kind of help give us a little bit of insight and a little bit of, I guess, clarity in terms of what's driving Paul's perspective, kind of again through David's situation, through the words of David. And the first thing that we see David kind of speaking about how God kind of works and bringing these ingredients together, preparing a feast before my enemies. The first thing we see is this reminder and this promise of a God who will feed me in spite of my enemies. A God who will feed me in spite of my enemies, in spite of the opposition, in spite of the adversity. And that's what we see in this. In fact, it's interesting. When in Hebrew, there's about 5 different translations for the word enemies in terms of translating it into English. But the one that's actually used here by David is a Hebrew word which literally means those who besiege me. Those who besiege me. And so you got to understand a little something about David and kind of why he would maybe kind of use that phrasing within this passage is because David was a military strategist. He was a warrior. He was a fighter. And so David, he understood a little something about how you would invade a city, how you would take a city, especially if that city was fortified, especially if it had walls, if it had defenses, is that the way you would take over a city, you'd gain control of a city, is you would besiege it. And then what's meant by besieging is literally means you would surround it, you would cut it off from all of its resources. Because you got to understand, is back then, is that oftentimes their resources, when it came to their water, a city's water or a city's food supply, their corn, their cattle, their beef, it was all outside the walls. And so if you wanted to take over a fortified city, what you would do is you would surround them, you would cut off their resources. And so here you have David going, listen. And I think reminding us of the importance of listen, as long as your focus, as long as your faith is in your resources, is in what's out there. Listen, what you do is you set yourself up for a situation where it can regularly be cut off. See, what he's getting at is so often, and the problem for so many of us is we tend to put our confidence. The reason so many of us, we fail to experience the feast, we fail to experience abundance, we fail to have that perspective like Paul had, like David had, to walk in joy, walk in victory, is we put our faith, we put our confidence not in a relationship, not in the relationship we have with Jesus, not on the inside. It's that we put our faith and our confidence in the resources outside. And again, as long as your confidence is out there, it can always be cut off. The enemy will love when he wants to steal your joy and steal your victory and steal your freedom. That's where he starts. He starts to cut off some of those resources. And listen, if your confidence is in your job, you got to know you can lose it. If your confidence is in the marriage, you can lose it. If your confidence is in your health, you can lose it. And yet what David's trying to get us to see is that, hey, look, that's why it's so important. You got to put your confidence in the one thing that can't ever be taken away from you. That relationship with Jesus. See, that what was driving the joy, what was driving the confidence, was not faith in what's out there, but in the relationship with Jesus in here. That's where he found the strength. That's where he found the confidence. And can't tell you, for some of us, the reason why your life doesn't feel like a joy ride, but feels a little more like an emotional roller coaster a lot of times, is because you've put your faith and confidence in everything out there. You've put your faith and confidence in this pursuit of happiness. In fact, literally, happiness literally means happenstance. It's all external. It's all what's going on around you, things that you can't control. And yet, if you want to experience joy, you want to experience that confidence to get through, listen, you've got to put your faith not in what's out there, but in that relationship with Jesus in here, in a source that can't be stolen, a source that can't be quenched, a source that can't run dry. You know, it's amazing to me, so oftentimes and the enemy loves to take this tactic of trying to get us to focus on what we need most is out there, in a relationship, in a job, and all this other stuff that's oftentimes so often beyond our control. And we get so caught up in there, and it's amazing, especially when adversity comes, when hardship comes. I'm amazed how many people sit there and say, "Well, I'd love to come to church. I'd love to, show up, but I've got all this stuff going on in my life." And rather than seeing the feast, rather than showing up to church, rather than showing up to a place where He's prepared the table, where you can get fed and you can get filled and renewed in your relationship with Jesus, this feast He sets before us, we get caught up and think, I can't do this right now. I got too much adversity. I got too much trial. And the enemy would love to get you to surrender, love to get you to give up by, again, putting your focus and allowing what's happening around there to drive you and to get you to lose sight of what you have in here, that relationship with Jesus. So the first thing, again, God will feed me in spite of my enemies. But get this, is that also God feeds me because of my enemies as well. God feeds me because of my enemies as well. I love, David had a little bit of Paul in him. It was almost like David was like, "Hey, go ahead, surround me. Go ahead, besiege me. I've got a source. I've got something on the inside that no matter what you take, no matter what you steal, no matter how much trouble you try to surround me with or come against me, hey, listen, I've got a source that will never run dry. I've got a shepherd who is always going to lead me, who's always going to guide me, who's always going to provide for me." And so I love this. And again, kind of reminds us when he says, you prepare for me a table before my enemies. He's also saying, listen, God feeds me even because of my enemies. I remember when I was going to University of Oklahoma, I would oftentimes on the weekend, I would come home from college so I could get a good meal. At my house, my mom would oftentimes, she'd just cook up, I'd show up on the weekend, she'd cook up these amazing dishes. And oftentimes, too, I would come home, and not just to get a good meal, but and something different than the ramen noodles I was living on for most of the week, but also so I could reconnect with some friends. And so typically, when I showed up to dinner or show up at the house, it wasn't typically just me. It was me and several, unexpected friends and unexpected company for my parents. And you got to understand something about my parents. Again, my parents, they grew up in Texas. They grew up kind of with this concept of Southern hospitality. And if you know anything about Southern hospitality and Southern cooking, is that, the golden rule is that you always have to have more than enough when it comes to food. You have to have more than enough. In fact, the worst thing when it comes to the concept of Southern hospitality and Southern cooking, the worst thing you could do is have too many people and not enough food. And which of course leads to the problem. Is that, my mom, she had this mindset. She had this philosophy, but how do you plan on the unexpected, right? All these, I'd bring home these friends and unexpected. And of course, I remember I used to always think that would make my dad frustrated and a little upset too. In fact, I remember one time apologizing to my dad. I'm like, sorry, I keep bringing over all my buddies, for dinner. And of course, my dad was like, what are you sorry for? I would be eating peanut butter and jelly if your friends because if your friends come over, I get way better food. And because here's the thing is that my mom, knowing this, again, the Southern hospitality, the Southern mindset, she knew that when she knew that she was planning on the unexpected, and how she planned on it was she would always make more than enough. She would always make more than enough. So my friends would come over and she'd immediately and start pulling out some stuff. So I'd show up and she'd have a dish of lasagna, it'd be great. But then when I showed up with like a couple extra friends, you would think it would throw her into, this nervous breakdown, this frustration. But no, she's like, well, I guess I got some soup here. Well, you're bringing Johnny over too? Well, I got some corn. I'll pull that out too, Or you brought over Russ. Let me pull out some beans. And I mean, it was like this never ending. It was like the fish and loaves. It just kept like reproducing itself in the oven. And look, I share that with you because I think God works in a very similar way when it comes to the troubles and the adversities in our lives. When opposition, when the enemy, when the adversity, when that struggle comes and takes a seat at your table, I think God does something very similar. I think, even as the enemies show up, the more enemies gather around, what does God do? He just pours out more. He just pulls out more. He brings out more out of your life. He pulls out more out of your life. He pours more into your life. When failure sits down, what does he do? Pulls out more grace. In fact, in Romans, he even says this very thing. He says, where sin abounds, grace abounds so much more. And so when failure sits down, he pours out just more grace. When struggle sits down, he pours out more perseverance. When heartache sits down, he pours out more comfort. When fear sits down, pours out more faith. That's the kind of God that we serve. See, he's not taken back. He's not taken by surprise when trouble comes and heartache comes. He sees it as an opportunity. In fact, that's why in James 1, he was able to say, I rejoice when trial comes because I know it's producing something. God's pulling more out of me. God's pouring more into me. See, what he would see oftentimes as a trial, and a lot of us would just see as a frustration, he saw as an opportunity. He knew that the more struggle, the more opposition, the more stuff came his way, God just was going to bring out more. He was going to do more. He was going to pour out more. That's the kind of God that we serve. That's the kind of God that we have. See, God feeds me in spite of my enemies. He feeds me because of my enemies. And then this last one, and I love this one, is that God sometimes even feeds me with the help of my enemies. God sometimes feeds me even with the help of my enemies. My father-in-law, he loves watching the Food Network channel. I don't know if he still watches this show, but there for a while he was like really into the Food Network Star. And basically how this show would work was that these guys, it'd be like, about 12, 15 contestants would show up, all kind of, aspiring chefs. And they would be kind of run through all these different kind of cooking challenges. And if you made it through, if you were the lone survivor at the end, you got your own show, you got tons of money, and it seemed like a pretty great deal. And so they would go through this. And inevitably, at the end of the show, they always had this kind of big surprise, like the ultimate challenge. It would always kind of come down to two contestants, and they would have like this ultimate cook-off challenge. And the surprise was this, which really, if you were to watch any of the episodes, they always act shocked when they would like do this. But if you watch any of the previous episodes, this is how it always worked out, was that at the very end, when it was the ultimate cooking contest, mano a mano, the ultimate food challenge, what was it that they always did to throw the little wrinkle into the cooking competition? Is that they would bring back some of their former rivals, some of the former contestants, the people that they were in a serious food fight against. They would bring them back and put them to work on each of their teams. Amen. And I love that. See, when David's in there saying, I prepare a feast in the presence of my enemies, he's not talking about, your enemies are going to kind of sit around you and there's going to come this moment where you're going to be able to look at them and say, I told you so. I told you it was going to work out, almost like you kind of get your revenge. And that's not what he's saying at all. No, what David's trying to get at is that when he's saying, I prepare a feast for you in the presence of your enemies. He's there saying, I can take all that adversity, all those obstacles. I can take that failure. I can take that fear, and I can put it to work for your good and my glory. I can make it work for you rather than against you. That's what he's getting at. In fact, a great picture of this as we kind of start to wrap up here is in Acts chapter 13, kind of getting back to Paul, of how God will sometimes can use our enemies. And let me be clear here too. It's not that he's the cause of your trouble, the cause of your heartache. It's just that he can take those ingredients, no matter how bad they are, and he can use them for your good and his glory. And so we see this. We see a great picture of this in Paul in Acts 13. I like what Luke says. He's kind of describing the situation here. In verse 49 it says, the word of the Lord spread through the whole region, but the Jewish leaders incited the God-fearing women of high standing and the leading of men in the city. They stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them from their region. So just basically what's going on here is Paul and Barnabas, things are going great. They're preaching the gospel. Things are happening. Lives are getting changed. Lives are getting saved. And then, which, by the way, kind of brings up a little quick side point here. I mean, you can be doing exactly what you're called to do, what you need to do, and then still face some trouble. Still face things not going the way you planned them to or expected them to or thought they would go. And yet I love Paul and Barnabas' response. Verse 51 says, so they shook the dust off their feet. They shook the dust off their feet, and kind of brings it back to what Jesus said in Luke, where he actually talks about, hey, if you go into a community, go into a town, and they don't accept you, hey, just shake the dust off your feet. Listen, some of you need to do that tonight. Some of you, the reason you're stuck, the reason you're not experiencing really the joy right now, living in joy, not living in victory, is because you've settled in a place of bitterness. You've settled in a place of unforgiveness. You haven't shaken the dust off your feet. And part of it is because, again, you put your faith in your circumstances and not in the character of a God who says, the good work I began in you, I'm faithful to complete it. I'm faithful to take, do you trust me that I can take these ingredients, I can take that heartache, I can take that failure and turn it into something for your good and my glory. And so they shake the dust off their feet. And here's what happens next. And it says that they go in verse 51, it says, they went on to this town known as Iconium, and the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. I love that. They go to a place called Iconium. Now again, Iconium was not what they had planned. It wasn't what they dreamed. It wasn't where Paul was wanting to go. Iconium was not on the agenda. And yet, check out what happens here. Acts 14:1. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. In other words, revival came to Iconium. Lives got changed at so much a greater level, a greater capacity than even before. But what brought them there? What got them to this place? What got them to this place where God used them in such a powerful way? The very same enemies who were stirring up opposition, stirring up trouble. Because, again, you gotta understand, God's not, he's not causing the trouble, but he can use the trouble for your good and his glory, right? And sometimes he'll take what your enemies would seek for harm, what your enemies would seek to destroy you, the things they would try to kind of stir up, to try to stir up the bitterness inside you, to try to stir up the anger inside you, to try to stir up the frustration. And what I love about our God is that when you put your confidence, when you put your faith, not in your circumstances, not in what's happening around you, but in the character of a God who says, listen, I'm working it for my good. I'm working it I'm working it behind the scenes. I'm creating something. I'm moving something. Listen, when your faith, when you got something that's not focused and living based on the outside circumstances, but what this relationship on the inside, what God does is he can take that same opposition, that same adversity, that same failure, and he'll use it to stir something up inside of you. He'll use it to stir up a greater call, to stir up a greater purpose, to stir up a greater mission. He can take the same thing, that same trouble, your enemy, your opposition, your struggle might have been trying to stir up to get you stuck and get you in a place where you're living in bitterness and living less than the victorious life you were created to live. He can take that and stir it up. Because, and you sit there and you think, well, why? Why that process? Because let's be honest. Some of us, if we're really honest about it, we don't pray the same way when times are going good as we do when times are tough. Like there's not that same urgency. There's not that same fervency. And if we're honest, it can be really easy for a lot of us to just kind of settle. To settle in the bitterness, to settle in the frustration, to settle for less than what God has called us to, less than what God created us for, less than the purpose he designed you for. And so he'll take and he'll allow some of that opposition to stir things up on you, not so you would get stuck, but actually just the opposite. A couple of weeks ago, it was my wife's birthday, and my boy had this great idea, like, hey, let's make mommy breakfast in bed, which was a great idea until the moment he abandoned me in the kitchen and went up there and crawled into the bed waiting for breakfast as well. And so in my mind, I thought, well, I'll create some omelets. I'll make some omelets. Well, the problem with omelets is that, I couldn't do it without it burning and starting to catch on fire. And so I thought, well, I'll just do a scramble. But even with a scramble, you got to keep stirring it, right? You got to keep stirring it, because if you don't stir it, what happens? It gets stuck. And that's the same way God works in our lives. You got to sometimes allow things to stir us up, not because he wants us to get stuck, but actually just the opposite, to get us unstuck, to release us, to stir up a greater call, greater purpose, greater significance in our lives. And in fact, getting back to Paul and getting back to this letter in Philippians, we see this very same thing. In fact, in that passage at the very end where he's talking about kind of his change, the very end of the first chapter here, I love what he says. Because something you got to understand about Paul is that Paul had this dream. Paul's dream ultimately was to go and to preach to the masses in Rome. And yet, instead of that dream seeming to come to reality, he finds himself in prison. He finds himself in a dire situation. He finds himself about the farthest point he could possibly seemingly be from Rome. And yet, I love his perspective. Talk about God using even the challenges and the struggles of what others sought to kind of stir up trouble, to get him stuck. God used it to stir up a greater purpose and a greater call and greater significance and impact. Listen to this. In verse 12, chapter 1. It says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Paul's dream was to preach to a city. And yet, all this challenge, all this struggle, all the things he couldn't have expected, ever planned on. Listen, his dream was to preach to a city. God's plan was for him to preach to the nations and to preach to generations. See, Paul never found himself in that prison, never found himself in this place of opposition, this place of struggle. He would have never penned those words. He never would have written the very letter of Philippians that we read today, that we draw encouragement from, that we draw hope from, that we discover and are reminded of this God who, regardless of your circumstance, regardless of your situation, I still got a good plan for you. I'm still working behind the scenes. You might not be able to see it, but I'm working and I'm stirring up something greater than you could have ever planned on, you could have ever hoped for. Listen, don't get so caught up in what's going on around here that you lose sight of what God's doing in here. Because God's got amazing plans for you, an amazing purpose for you. He's stirring something great inside of you. He's doing something well beyond your imagination or your plans. I want to pray for you tonight. And